Hi, I'm Carrie Jones, and this is my presentation on my action research project. I did my project on explicit vocabulary instruction and how that affects vocabulary acquisition in third grade students. I chose this question because as a third grade team and as a school really, we have struggled with vocabulary. And by vocabulary I mean tier 2 words primarily. That's kind of the focus during this study. But we also have a hard time with even tier 1 and definitely tier 3 words. So we chose as a team this year to work on vocabulary instruction. And so I have looked over data and just been very interested in, was this really successful? Because it was a challenging topic. It was a challenging thing to teach, but I think we did some good things, but there's definitely room for improvement, and you'll see that throughout the study and through the data that there were great things, but there were also things about this that we could do better or could do differently. This was not only a grade level problem, it was also school-wide, so a team of our teachers went to the Kentucky Reading Project, and we've learned all kinds of ways to teach vocabulary, assess vocabulary, studies of vocabulary. We've really focused on this. Felt like we came up with a good starting point. We worked as a team each week as a third grade team to choose vocabulary that was meaningful to the text that we were reading, that was meaningful to students in their everyday life. So it was really that solid tier 2 vocabulary that students use on a daily, not necessarily a daily basis, but they would use regularly or that they would see regularly. So we would choose before reading each word that we were going to use and create a PowerPoint for the words and determine how we were going to present these words each week. We tried to follow the same model each week where we presented with a PowerPoint that had pictures and definitions and parts of speech. Then we'd read through the text and underline and highlight the words in the text, practice them in the text, put them on the word wall, and use them in our speech each week, use them in our conversations with students, praise students who use those words from the word wall, and encourage them to look to the word wall for writing and reading purposes. In this study that I conduct, I analyze the pre and post assessments and the map test to determine the effectiveness of the instruction. And the goal was just to provide kids with tier 2 vocabulary that they could use, feel confident in, and help them to understand the text that they read in third grade. So that's my purpose. Vocabulary helps us to comprehend text. So when those babies that we have, they're reading, and we've noticed that they are maybe fluent readers, and maybe they do read well and word call well, but they have no idea what the text is about once you ask them about it. So they've read and read and read, but then when you say, oh, what's this text saying to you? They don't know, because they don't know those words that are common words in third grade level text. So we wanted to give them a bank of those, and I wanted to determine how effective this was in our classrooms. 3 different sources of literature that I researched for this project were, they talked about what vocabulary is, how do you teach it, and what are the benefits of teaching vocabulary. So what is vocabulary? Vocabulary is words and definitions. It's the relationships between words. It's, depending on who you're talking to, words that you can't necessarily find in context, find the definition of. It's words that are maybe used frequently. Studies from Bromley show that vocabulary quality is more important than quantity. So really knowing the words is more important than kind of knowing a lot of words. So we tried to focus on just 7 words per week and make sure those kids knew those 7 words. students usually leave high school knowing 40,000 words. So our students, we've got to push them on vocabulary to help them know 40,000 words. So, how do you teach vocabulary? Best practice is not looking up the word in a dictionary and writing a definition. Best practice tells that we link words to new concepts. We use words. We learn strategy for learning words and word meanings. And Scott introduces a kind of way to study vocabulary, and he uses the adopt strategy, which is apprenticeship with the word, where you're practicing with the word, discussions about a word, opportunities to use the word, planning for how we're going to teach the word, and just the time with the words. So that's the best way to help students understand new vocabulary that we're using. Benefits of the instruction, it, according to Bromley again, makes up 70 to 80% of comprehension for all students, but for focused on my third grade students, 70 to 80% of comprehension. And that fully supports what we've noticed talking to our students and in conversations with each other, that these kids can read, they can't comprehend, and it's because they don't know the words. Students with vocabulary, according to Bromley, score higher on standardized tests, and vocabulary instruction just improves the breadth and depth of their vocabulary. So my question for this study is, how does explicit vocabulary instruction affect third grade students' vocabulary acquisition? Like I said earlier, the reasons were just because we've noticed as a school in a grade level that this is the struggle our students have with comprehension. We identified this as a growth area for our school this past year, and we've been working on it. According to MAP, 57% of students are below proficient levels in reading, and one of the sections of MAP talks about vocabulary acquisition. So we know that that's directly tied to that percentage of students who are not reaching proficiency. We want to determine how to teach vocabulary and how it does actually impact their vocabulary acquisition. So does our instruction of vocabulary, does it even help them? Does it actually stick with them? According to Allington, students after 6 weeks should remember about 40%. So you have to adjust your thinking here. 40% is actually a good percentage of students to retain while they are trying to remember all of these new Tier 2 words. And we also want to encourage parents to use words at home, because kids who are exposed to words at home, they also have a better vocabulary at school. I used my own third grade class for this action research project. There were 28 students, ages 8 to 10. I had 14 girls and 14 boys. And 5 of those had an IEP for reading, 3 of them an IEP for writing, 5 students with an IEP for math, 3 students with behavior interventions, and 3 RTI students. 18 of my students were scoring at grade level or higher, which left 10 of them not reaching grade level. The instruments that I used for this were the MAP test, to determine a baseline at winter, because we didn't start in August or September. We started in the winter, so I used the winter map as a baseline for my data to determine the need for vocabulary instruction. Then I also used anecdotal notes and things that we had noticed in the conversations we had to determine that need. During vocabulary instruction, we used pre-assessments that we created as well as post-assessments that we created to determine the effectiveness of instruction. So there's 2 different things that I'm measuring here. One is the need, and one is the other is the effectiveness. The quarterly assessments were to determine the long-term acquisition of vocabulary. So did it stick after the 6 weeks? we used a weekly PowerPoint, and the book that we used to find our text was the ACT book. It's called Accessing Complex Text. It's just a resource where we get our reading materials for each week. And we also used a vocabulary word wall. So in my classroom I have a word wall for regular words, I have our math word wall, and then I have a vocabulary word wall. And we just talk about they're there for us to remember that we can use them, remember what they mean, encourage us to use them in everyday speech. So the MAP is a computer adaptive program that assesses 3 different things in reading, and it assesses if students are on grade level and predicts where they'll be by the end. 59% of students were below proficiency level entering 3rd grade, but the percentage decreased to 57% of students by the end of 3rd grade. So the jump was not much. The percentage points changed by 2 percentage points. So you would say that's probably not extremely effective instruction, but it did decrease. The other material that we used were the teacher-made pre-assessments. These pre-assessments asked students to rate their knowledge of different words. It took a lot of coaching and instructing to teach students how to take a pre-assessment and how to rate their knowledge. So we really had to coach them. Do I know this word 100%, or do I have no idea, or am I somewhere in the middle there? More than half of the students rated their knowledge of all vocabulary words as below proficient. So we saw that students don't even know what the words meant. Another instrument I used were the teacher-made pre-assessments or post-assessments, where we used several different types of questions. The first post-assessment we graded manually. The second post-assessment we used GradeCam, which proved to be a much more efficient way of collecting data and grading the assessments. Students scored an average of 73% on their second post-assessment. So by the end, the amount of words that they were retaining was much greater. Here you can see that we used our weekly PowerPoint. The story was taken from our ELA, the vocabulary is taken from the ELA story, and we tried to keep our vocabulary thematically grouped. So maybe we would use, I know one example was adverbs. So one week we chose all powerful adverbs, and another week we chose all words from history, or whatever the topic of the story was, we tried to closely relate our theme of our vocabulary to the topic of the story, so that students would have something to group their knowledge in, and really pockets to put those vocabulary words and their understanding of them. Here's just a picture of our ACT book. It's grade level passages, lesson ideas, comprehension questions. This is where we get our passages most of the time, unless we need something else. It is aligned to the Common Core, and it has thematic units. So we are able to kind of use the themes through those units and carry them in through our vocabulary. There are 4 days of lessons included in here. We actually do more. Vocabulary is always our second day. Our first day is annotating the text, and vocabulary always comes second. Here's just an image of word wall, and students can see the spelling and just a reminder to use the word. This was effective because they see it every day, and you can see them always looking back at the word wall and trying to use those words. I see that on a daily basis. That's how I know that this is effective for students. So my data collection, I use the MAP winter to spring. I used my pre-assessments and my post-assessments. Pre-assessments were before each week of vocabulary, and post-assessments were 2 different times, about every 6 weeks. So I used one kind of in the early spring or really late winter, and then one in the later mid-spring. According to the map, so this is analysis of the winter map, and you can see that 57% of students were below proficiency cut scores, which means 57% of the students did not even meet proficiency. And for us, we consider 80% to be a good amount of students meeting proficiency. So for 57% of students to be there, that's not what we are looking for. So we knew we needed to do work. Some possible reasons. One, I had 8 students who were either RTI or IEP, and that computer adaptive test for them is a struggle. It's a struggle because they're not always read to, they can't always focus, they have to sit in one spot, there's not accommodations, we look for a raw score. So a lot of my students struggled with that, and then they also struggled in all 3 areas of the MAP test: literature, nonfiction, and vocabulary. The number of students at or above proficiency in benchmark. So this chart shows from winter to spring, and when I created this chart I really struggled because all it shows is that the kids either stayed the same or went down, which is troubling. We went from 12 kids meeting benchmark to 10 kids meeting benchmark, and that really worried me. But some reasons for this was I was out during the spring map, I was on maternity leave, and I know that my students really feed off me encouraging them. That's one thing that we really work on, is that rapport, and so I'm certain that it was not as strong of a test with me out of the building for 6 weeks before they took the test. Another one was a change in student population. Change in student population. So I had several, about 5 kids move out and 5 kids move in. So that, took out certain students and added different clientele that affected my scores. And assessment was not read to my IEP students. So we chose to not read that to them, and that greatly affected their score. This is the number of students. It's focused on the MAP test. So it's showing how the number of students scoring 190 or above in the winter was lower than the number of students in the spring. And this is just on vocabulary. So when you break apart your MAP test into literary, nonfiction, and vocabulary, this is just looking at their vocabulary scores. So where the last slide showed that students went down, or the number of students meeting proficiency went down, when I look at just vocabulary, it shows that the number of students meeting proficiency actually did increase. So that tells me that vocabulary was important to focus on, and that we did a good job because that category did improve. The long-term memory for IEP students could be a factor for some of them. Some of them, that's a struggle, and so that's going to affect how they perform on the MAP test and that vocabulary. Struggling readers also struggled with having that strong academic vocabulary, but they're not challenged at home. A lot of times those struggling readers are the ones who nobody's reading to at home. They're not challenged. So they had a hard time with that. The number of students scoring below 181 stayed the same from winter to spring. However, the number of students scoring above did increase. So you've got that little gap there where we didn't look at the number of students, and that's the gap that separated. So where we went from here, they increased and decreased for the spring. The question types on MAP are also something that I think is a factor in this, because they ask questions in a way that I don't always talk about for vocabulary. So that's one area I want to improve in. Not that MAP's necessarily the reason we're doing vocabulary, but it would be good to expose them to that kind of questioning. My summary for my MAP test just shows that 65% of students still were not proficient in vocabulary in 3rd grade, but the average performance in vocabulary acquisition and use, not where I want them to be for a MAP test in all of reading. It is encouraging that the vocabulary portion did get better, it did improve. So trends show that students who have been struggling with reading did not make vocabulary gains. So I've seen that I've met my solid readers and I've met my average readers and helped push them, but it has not helped those struggling kids. So kind of that gap group, still they didn't make gains, and those are really the kids who need it the most. So we've got to relook at how we're giving this instruction, how we're meeting those kids, and look at their needs for their type of instruction and how we can help them learn new vocabulary and help it stick with them. Possible reasons for this, the time we spent on vocabulary instruction. You need an entire class period to teach this, but we really did it in 10 minutes at the beginning of each class. So it's not a lot. So for those kids who do struggle, that's not much time for them. The number of practice activities for students was also a big factor, I think, because this was our first year, so we were just kind of jumping in, not knowing exactly what we were doing, but we did, we tried. So that was our starting point. I'm seeing through the data that we do need to give more opportunities for practice, because hopefully that's going to help catch those kids who are struggling, who aren't getting the vocabulary. My pre-assessment, really all I wanted from this was just to see what students, only 12% of students thought they knew they were proficient on pre-assessment. So 12% of students didn't necessarily need the vocabulary instruction as much. However, we taught different words every week, so they are learning some words still. Even if they technically meet proficiency, they're still learning more words. On average, 88% did not meet benchmark for Tier 2 words. They come from homes without rich vocabularies. They're not reading those challenging type of texts. So a lot of times our struggling readers are reading text below grade level. So they're getting vocabulary below grade level, and they're not being pushed to learn new things because they don't know how to read those Tier 2 words. So they're not getting the rich vocabulary in what they're reading. Another thing to think about is we haven't focused on vocabulary before this year. So students haven't had that formal instruction for them to learn new vocabulary. That's why this has been so important. Kind of shows teachers, like, we need instruction for these kids. This is a big part of why they're not comprehending, and the data proves that. It proves that we're struggling, and this is an area we're struggling in. On my first quarterly assessment, my summative, my results were lower than expected. 39.8% of students were scoring proficient. However, when I look back at the research, I see that proficient in this case is only 40%. I'm sorry, it's 39.8% was the average score. So 40% should be the score that they meet to show that they're meeting proficient after 6 weeks. So we were actually pretty close to that. I was not too let down once I looked through research. At first it felt like 40% as an average score was really hard, but once I looked through research, I saw that 40% is actually it's a perfectly fine place to be after 6 weeks. Some possibilities, reasons that student might not have scored higher, were that this was their first time to really take vocabulary tests, learn vocabulary explicitly, be focused on vocabulary. So they didn't quite know what to expect. So this was all new for them. So that's one reason that maybe assessment average was lower. They didn't have enough time. Now looking back and knowing what we know, we needed to focus more on time for vocabulary instruction. And the type of questions. The first test had a lot of fill in the definition, fill in the blank, things like that were more open-ended, and that was harder for students. The second post-assessment, the scores greatly increased. Now, I think that type of assessment was a huge factor. I think that amount of time we spent on vocabulary was a big factor. After the first test, we adjusted our instruction to spend a little bit more time, be a little more intentional, and that's going to help your scores grow. So the intervention changed, which makes it hard to look at for data purposes. However, you can't keep doing something that's not effective just to get data. So we did change our amount of time spent on the same vocabulary. And IEP students in this test did have a resource time where they were read to individually. So that drastically changed their scores. All of these questions were matching type questions. They may have been matching to a blank, but they at least had kind of something to look at for them to kind of have a better visual rather than just open-ended fill in the blanks or open-ended write the definition, things like that. So that was a big thing for this test. With the combined quarterly assessments, the graph shows that the trend lines for the first assessment, there were greater number of students scoring in the lower end of the spectrum, and there were a lower number of students scoring in the higher end of the spectrum, and then it reverses by the test too. So I know that those students that were scoring lower moved up, and the students that were scoring higher also moved up. So we're moving in the right direction. It's not where we want to be, but we are getting there. And the percentages and the graphs, they look great. But I am concerned that the type of assessment or type of instruction, since it did change, could affect that. Here I just kind of break apart my IEP and RTI students and how they improved. They did not all improve at a rate that I'd want them to. However, they do mostly all show improvement. One thing I was interested in is one student actually went down a good percent, and I'm curious to know why. I can't remember, but looking back, I wonder, was he absent a lot the week that we studied certain vocabulary, or had something happened, or what happened to cause this one student to go down? Possibilities for their increase, however, as a whole, they did get a reader for their full test, so that is huge for those students. The type of assessment was different, where they had a visual kind of for each question that they could match. And we integrated much more of the vocabulary into what we were already doing, and that helped them compartmentalize the new learning we were doing. One thing that was a big negative that we would have to change is that this is a long assessment. It's a long assessment for third graders. It's a long assessment for those IEP students. It's just long, and so I think they kind of get over it, and they're just not giving their best effort after a while, because it is a lot of words to remember, and if you're not sure, then it's hard. I noticed a lot of these students were also guessing, so I've got to figure out ways to help those students who, when they get unsure, they're just guessing around and marking answers, and we can't have that. The pre and post assessments show that proficiency improved from 12% proficient to 28% proficient. That's a huge jump in vocabulary acquisition. And I know that the type of assessment affected the results. So I realized that, and I also realized that the amount of time spent on vocabulary changed. So they should do better, but I think that in general, their acquisition and their understanding of vocabulary did increase over time, and they were learning new words because they were able to use these new words in their writing and reading. The gap group students typically benefited, as you saw in the chart. They, for the most part, improved. I do know that we will have to do more tailoring instruction for them, so seeing how they learn best and how we need to help them with, hands-on materials or long-term memory or making connections, things like that that are more important for those students. They actually work for all students. So when you find something that works for those students, give it a try for all of the students, because it probably will help them too. More practice with words is necessary. That is one thing I saw from my pre and post assessments, and the MAP test too, and even just anecdotal notes and observations. More time is necessary. So in general, this was a beneficial study. It was beneficial to teach the vocabulary. The data supports it. Vocabulary understanding and assessment scores, they all increased. So just by us taking 10 minutes out of our ELA lessons to pre-teach vocabulary, to talk about it, to reinforce it in reading, to show pictures and definitions, to have it on the wall, all of those things, those were simple things. They took 10 minutes maximum. Those things all increase their vocabulary, understanding, and knowledge. So if you can do that once a week even, and just reinforce it through your stories, then your students' vocabulary, we did 7 words a week for 20 weeks, and so that's 140 new words that they knew that they wouldn't have known had we not done this stuff. So I see that it's beneficial. I've seen from the data that it did increase. I've seen from the anecdotal notes that it did increase. However, the exact amount of increase and benefit, I'm not positive. This year I would like to do more standardized assessment or more focused assessment for vocabulary and pull some of those out that I could use. I analyzed how students made progress over the course of the year with tier 2 words, and how the vocabulary impacted gap groups as well. And I can see positives to what I did and negatives. The type of assessment, again, is a main thing, and it would be beneficial. I'm excited to present this to staff members, because as a school, we haven't had a focus on teaching vocabulary. We've always known that it's a struggle. We talk about that it's a struggle. We, brainstorm ideas, but we never put it into practice. So I'm encouraged to see that through vocabulary instruction that my students have grown. They have improved. They have made better scores over the weeks. It doesn't take much time, and it's giving them extra words that they might not know that they'll come across in life, because these are tier 2 words that they see over and over in what they're reading, what they're seeing in real world situations. So I think my staff would benefit from seeing my personal results, and how even lower and higher achieving students, they all moved forward, they all moved up, they all gained something from this. It wasn't just reaching the higher kids or the lower kids or the middle, it was reaching all students, because all students grew. And I think that once people see that all students have grown and that they know more words, and even the MAP test was affected, I think once people see that, they'll be willing to take 10 minutes a day just to present a PowerPoint, just to talk through these words, just to point it out in the text and write it on the wall. It's not much, but it's been beneficial, and my research has shown that it is important for these students, and it's important for them to have the chance to learn explicitly these new words. Thank you.